if you're offered the choice between a statistics lecture and a dental appointment, can we have a poll? It's not got a very good image, has it? But it's a totally fascinating subject. But nevertheless, statisticians sometimes do very boring things, like they insist on tossing coins, don't they? That's one of the most boring things a statistician does. I've got a coin here, I want you to toss it. What do you think is going to happen? So I found it very rarely. I got this yesterday. It's an 85 pence coin. So I'm going to hand it round, and if you want to just pass it on to the next person rapidly, I won't be offended. But otherwise, just toss it a few times, and I'll ask you later how likely you think it comes down heads. All right? Because at least it's not an object I suspect many of you have seen before. Not sure whether it'll catch on. Slightly more seriously, there's a rather wonderful book which I'll pass round called Charting the Lion's Stare, the story of river blindness mapping in Africa. And I'll refer to one or two excerpts from that book as I go along, because statistics, if it's only a branch of mathematics, in my world is missing the point. Statisticians use mathematics to interact with all sorts of other people's problems. One of my early professors used to tell me that the great thing about statistics is it gives you an excuse to poke your nose into everybody else's business. And the business that I poke my nose into is largely to do with public health. Some of it in the UK, some of it in places far afield, in particular in Africa. And so I'm going to sort of take you through the story of one of my recent and continuing research projects. And you'll be pleased to know I've taken out all the Greek letters and almost all the equations. Okay? I am going to leave the slides on the computer. So just in case anybody at the school does want to follow up some of the details, this is actually the work on which the talk is based. But I'm not going to go into all those technical details here. It would, however, be remiss of me, and this is another point that's well worth making, not to acknowledge that almost any piece of statistical work, in contrast to some more sort of scholarly disciplines, involves teams, and those teams are often multinational and multidisciplinary. So the work that I'm going to be talking about certainly has its technical heart in Lancaster, but it also involves people in West Africa, and slightly more surprisingly, people in New York, whose role I'll explain when the time comes. But before I tell you about disease in Africa, I'm going to take you through what I mean when I talk about statistical modelling. Then most of the talk will be about this disease, lower, which is related to a more serious disease whose common name is river blindness. And then I'll just finish by giving you a kind of little philosophical discourse on why I think statistics is fascinating and how it should be done. But I want to convey how a statistician approaches science by paying homage to, of course, one of the all-time great people of science, Isaac Newton. And Newton, in particular, for those of you who don't study physics, was famous, amongst other things, for setting out the laws that govern forces near the Earth's surface, in particular, how objects fall under the influence of gravity. There's a story which is almost certainly apocryphal that he had an insight when he had an apple falling off a tree, but I'm sure that wasn't actually true. But he studied the physics of what happens when things fall. And as you know, if you drop something, it starts quite slowly and it then accelerates and gets faster. Now, some years ago, I was asked to teach statistics to our first-year physics students, and so I got the lab technicians to set up this little piece of apparatus. And what it is a ruler, measured out in some units, probably millimeters, and it has a movable clamp on it to which is attached an electromagnet. And the electromagnet is linked by a switch to a stopwatch, so that depending on which way you throw the switch, either the magnet will be on and the watch will be at 0, or the magnet will go off and the watch will start ticking round. And there's a ball bearing stuck to the magnet at the moment. And what we asked the physics students to do was to simply play with this apparatus and tell us how they would use it to estimate what is the rate of acceleration of that ball as it drops from, at the moment it's going at 0 kilometers or meters per second because it's stationary, and if you turn the magnet off it'll drop and it'll accelerate. And what Newton, amongst many other things, told us was how quickly how big that acceleration constant is, how quickly it gains speed. And we left them to do exactly what they wanted with the equipment. And what one student did for us was produce this picture with data. So the distance is the height that they chose to clamp the electromagnet at. Okay, it's actually set up so it's the height of the bottom of the ball from the bench. And the time is the time in seconds that it took the object to fall, because they can, you know, that when the thing hits the deck, they throw the switch, you see. And so we said, well, what do we do with that then? Now, if I showed this to most first-year statistics students who hadn't done A-level physics, I know what they'd do. They'd get their ruler out and they'd draw a straight line, right? And most people would look at that and say, oh yes, line of best fit. They draw a straight line through the data. It's probably in the school syllabus now, isn't it? Line of best fit, yeah. But that would be entirely the wrong thing to do. And the reason it's the wrong thing to do is because these aren't just red dots on a graph. There's some science behind it. And you have to think about the science when you're analysing the data. And what Newton told us is that actually the distance and the time are indeed related. The higher the distance, the bigger the time. But the relationship is that the distance should be proportional to time squared, right? If this was a maths lecture, I'd prove it, possibly. But it isn't, so I won't. And if distance is proportional to time squared, then if I take square roots on both sides, the square root of distance should be proportional to time. And I think you can already see, now that I've told you what it should be, that it's a curve. It's not a straight line, right? But Newton told us what to do to make it into a straight line. We take the square root of the distance and compare it with time. And now you probably could justify just getting your ruler out and drawing a line of best fit. Or if you really insist, you could use some computer program. But it would basically just draw a line through those points. Which is kind of reassuring, because Newton was pretty bright. He probably got it right. Oh dear. Because Newton said that it should be the black line. Because obviously, if you go zero distance, it should take zero time, right? So that's a bit of a problem. So what's going on? Well, I think many of you will recognize what's going on. But does anybody feel bold enough to answer either of those questions for me? Why doesn't the line that goes through the data, why doesn't it go through zero? Because according to Newton's theory, it should, and according to common sense, it should. Remember what we're doing? We're switching the watch on, we hear it hit the ground, and we have a reaction time. So that query is your average reaction time. And if you'd had a couple of beers, it would be bigger, right? Why don't the points lie on exactly a straight line? Because Newton said they should. But Newton was talking about an ideal experiment done under perfect conditions. And this is a pretty crude set of equipment. And sometimes your reaction time's a bit longer than average, and sometimes your reaction time's a bit shorter than average. So you get that little wobble around the line. And frankly, if all of our data looked like that, us statisticians would be out of a job. Because you don't need to be a genius to say, yes, Newton was right. We understand why the law doesn't fit because it's human reaction time. And if we're interested, we can get an idea of how variable reaction time is. Okay, and an 85 pence coin is much harder to toss successfully than a conventional one because it's asymmetric. Okay, so what's the point of that little introduction? Well, the point is that I've turned a piece of science, which is Newton's law, into a statistical model which recognizes Newton's law, but also recognizes that in a crude experiment, the law won't be followed perfectly. And the nature of the variations about the perfect law are not entirely predictable. If I asked you to predict, if the student was doing another measurement and they'd set the equipment up so that the square root of the distance was 6 units, and I asked you to predict what the answer would be, the best you could do is predict on the line, the black line. But if I then said, and what do you think, will it be above the line or below the line, it would be a pure guess, wouldn't it? And that's where statistics comes in useful, because statistics quantifies that uncertainty about what the true relationship is. So it estimates Newton's law, it estimates, as a bonus, human reaction time, and it also tells you how variable human reaction time is. Okay, now, if you understood that, then the only difference between that and what I did to try to help people understand disease in Africa was really technical complication. The ideas are really all there now, that you have some science which suggests that things should be related in a certain way. You collect some data, which is empirical evidence out there in the real world of what's actually happening. You try to relate the two, but the critical thing that a statistician can do is actually acknowledge that if the relationship isn't really clean and tidy, we can actually quantify the untidiness. We call it uncertainty or randomness, and therefore we can say, you can conclude this from your experiment and only this. And that one of the things that bedevils statisticians is that they're forever having to disappoint people because people want simple answers, and statisticians usually give them an answer of maybe. But we quantify maybe by probably or probably not. And we do it in a very rigorous way, but that shouldn't stop us getting the basic message through. So the analogy I like with statistics is this is, of course, a very convenient analogy. It's a bit like Mozart's music, which is a good thing to be like, you all agree. Because when Mozart played a new piece for his sponsor, the Emperor Joseph II, who fancied himself as a pianist but wasn't actually very good, said, "Too many notes, Mr. Mozart, too many notes." And Mozart was rumoured to have replied, "Only as many as there needed to be." And the point is that we make our models as complicated as they need to be, but no more complicated. So a statistician is always saying, you don't want to fit a fantastically complicated curve to these data. What you want to do is say, the essence is the straight line, but it's not Newton's straight line because of physiology, and it's not a perfect fit because of variations in reaction time. So we complicate the model, but just enough. What we don't try and do is fit an incredibly complicated wiggly curve exactly through the data. Okay, so this is Mozartian statistics. And now let's get on to the meat of the evening. And this is one of the quotes from the book that some people are looking at as it comes round. A visitor to Uganda in 1864, really saying, you know, life here must be pretty hard. And it was. And in many parts of rural Africa, it still is. And this fly, apart from tormenting the people because the bites hurt, actually spreads disease. And the disease that it spreads is really rather devastating. If you ever have the chance to visit the World Health Organization's headquarters in Geneva, or indeed several other places around the world dedicated to public health in tropical countries where replicas of this statue are mounted, this is the living evidence, well, it's a statue, so it's not really living, but you know what I mean, of river blindness. This is a picture of rural life in Africa that was very, very common up to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. It's still seen today, but thankfully in lower numbers, of a man who's been turned blind in middle age, and he's being led by a young boy, and he's been turned blind by river blindness, which is a consequence of that fly biting him some years previously. That's the geographical extent of this problem in Africa. Onchocerciasis is the formal name for a disease colloquially known as river blindness. It's endemic in wet tropical regions, not just in Africa. There is also some in Asia and some in Amazonia, in the Brazilian rainforest. And all of these countries are affected by it, but all of these countries are also participating in WHO-coordinated programs to try to control the disease. And there's a very simple and very effective way to control this disease. You take a pill every year, and that's it. So what's the problem? The problem, of course, is there's no money in these countries, and pills cost money. Fortunately, an international drug company, Merck, makes this drug in a factory. Used to be in Mexico. I think they moved it to Belgium. But anyway, they make this drug in a factory, and they ship it to the West African ports. And they dump it on the docks, and they don't charge them for it. So the drugs are given free of charge. But you've still got a massive problem of distributing the drugs to a population where you don't have the kind of tidy society that we have in well-developed, rich countries. So how are you going to get the drug out to these people? So what they did was said, well, we can't target people who've got the disease because we just don't have the infrastructure. So what we'll do is we'll give it to everybody. Now that's still pretty hard, and it means you're giving pills unnecessarily to people who don't need them. But given the alternative, everybody agreed that was a good thing to do. Until they found that in some of the areas that they did this, some of the people who got the pills had a severe reaction to what had previously been thought to be a very safe drug. And some of them, several hundred of them, died within 24 hours of receiving the pills, which was completely unheard of. And it turned out that the problem, I mean, it's an awful story, but it's also part of the endless fascination of nature. It turned out that although this drug was very good at killing the parasites that would otherwise have turned the person blind, if that person was co-infected with another parasite spread by a different biting fly, that would set up an antagonistic reaction. The biochemistry would go haywire, and there was a small probability, very small but measurable, that that person would suffer a severe reaction, which if not treated would be fatal. And of course, how do you treat people if they have a bad reaction in rural West Africa? So what was then discovered by some work that I was not involved with is that you could actually quantify the risk of this happening, and it was if you were heavily co-infected with river blindness parasites and these other parasites called lower parasites, there was a risk of this severe reaction. And so the WHO evolved the policy of saying, we will only give people the pills and leave them to it in areas where there's not much lower, and if there's a lot of lower, we'll need to get in teams of paramedics so that when we give them, we'll still give them the pills, but we'll have to have paramedics on hand to treat them promptly if they do go into anaphylactic shock. And that way, they won't die. So that operationally was quite a complication to the project. And it raised the question, how do you find out where there's a lot of lower, a lot of eyeworm? We don't have a lot of hospitals here. We don't have disease registers. How can we find out which people? Because, if you've got lower parasites in your body, you're not necessarily ill. You'll be asymptomatic for years. So you have to find out what's going on. And that is the problem that we were approached to work on, and that's where statistics turns out to have a big role to play. The WHO set a policy that if they could be confident that lower prevalence, in other words, the proportion of people in a local village who are lower infected exceeded 20%, they would put in the paramedics, the precautionary treatment. So the question is, over that area of Africa, where is there at least a 20% prevalence of infection with lower? And that's the problem we were asked to solve. Just to sort of really give you the context of what happens, this is what happens when you first get bitten by a fly that's carrying the lower parasites. These are individual blood cells you can see in the background slide. And this is what happens if you leave it for a few years. It migrates to the eye, and you can just see there a worm sort of trickling along the white of the eye. It's actually not in itself, unpleasant though it is, a terribly serious condition by West African standards. The problem with it is that if you've got that infection but unknown, and you get the pills to protect you against river blindness, you could have the anaphylactic shock. Very small proportions, but there we go. So that's the WHO policy. If we knew there was a 20% prevalence of lower, we'd call that high risk, we'd be careful. Otherwise, we'd just go ahead and give everybody the pills. How do you find out where these areas are? Well, the answer is you get some data. And this is where we turn to a branch of statistics that we've been working on for some years at Lancaster called geostatistics. And it has its origins, and this is why it's called geostatistics, in the mining industry in South Africa in the 1950s. And one of the wonderful things about statistics is how different areas connect in surprising ways. So it turns out that work that was originally motivated by digging for gold actually helps us combat disease in Africa some 50 years later. And the puzzle I'm now asking you is the following. If you think of this XY system as a geographical area in which you're deciding, I'm looking for gold, okay? And before I came along, some people had already beaten me to it, and those black circles are indicating how much gold they'd found, right? Now, I've been offered, for the same price, the rights to mine one of those two question mark locations. Nobody's been there before. So the price to do it is the same. Put your hand up if you'd buy the location near the top of the square. And put your hand up if you'd buy the location near the bottom of the square. And put your hand up if you think on principle one shouldn't be digging for gold. And there you go. Okay, right. And so what you've just done is demonstrate an intuitive grasp of spatial correlation. So that's something you didn't know you could grasp intuitively, is it? Because what we're saying is it's sometimes called the first law of geography, which says that everything's related, but things that are close together geographically are often more closely related than things that are far apart geographically. So what you're mentally doing is you're saying there's a lot of big black dots near the bottom. I think there's a lot of gold generally down there. Whereas at the top you're saying, it just looks as though it's fitting out. And you're implicitly building a model in your brain that this isn't just a bunch of random numbers that I've slung down on the paper. This is actually some process in nature. And you're implying that it has some kind of spatial structure to it. And you're exploiting that in making the same decision that I would, which is I'm predicting that the lower question mark will bring me more gold than the upper question mark. Well, that's the picture for the country of Cameroon. Those are the locations on a map of villages where people have done surveys of what proportion of people in the village are infected with lower. And they do that by taking blood samples. Now, you can't take 60 million blood samples. Apart from anything else, it's dangerous in these countries just to prick somebody's finger. All sorts of things could get in. But for the greater good of the community, samples of people have been taken in these villages, which are a tiny fraction of the total number of villages in the country. And again, you can see that phenomenon that the different colours are not randomly mixed together. There's some structure there, isn't there? And we can exploit that structure in saying that, you know, if you were going to say how much lower do you think there is sort of here-ish, you'd probably say quite a lot. And if I asked you how much lower there is up in the northwest, you'd probably say not so much. And again, you're making that kind of judgment. So what we really want to do is refine that process. And I put this flip chart up to give us a little bit of a break, although I'll see if you're game. Would anyone like to volunteer to make a prediction based on this graph here, if I explain what it is? I've tried to indicate that it's a geographical graph. I'm walking here from west to east, right? And every so often I stop and I take some blood samples and I plot the proportion of the blood samples that have got the lower parasites in them, right? Okay, and so what I want you to do is say, well, if you wanted a continuous curve indicating what the results would be, what would you do? Right? Does anybody want to have a go? Come and draw a curve. Tell me what you think would happen if we actually took blood samples everywhere along, right? Oh. There you go. What's your name? Zachary. Zachary. Okay, Zach, off you go. Zachary, beg your pardon. Go. There you go, right. So Zachary has a model in his brain. Notice that it's not a line of best fit, it's a curve, right? So that's an interesting mathematical model. Would anyone else like to have a go? Suppose I asked you then to say, do you think that's really what's doing, or maybe it's doing that? I mean, in terms of how close that is to data, it's pretty hard to know, isn't it? Right? And let me ask you a third question. Since I know what it is here, why don't I have a curve that goes through the data? Now that's where my 85 pence coin comes in. Did anybody actually try tossing it a few times? And so what do you think the probability of a head is for that coin? Okay, so the probability is 100%, right? Anybody else have a go? What did you get? 50%. Okay, anybody else? Sorry? 50. Anybody else? You only tossed it twice, didn't you? Admit it. No. All right, anybody else? Okay, but that serves to make the point that we don't know because, crudely speaking, two people did the same experiment and got different answers, right? So as a statistician, I can say the first thing I want to know about these red dots is how many people. Was this 50% of 2 or 50% of 200? And actually, in the real data, the typical sample size was about 100, which sounds pretty good. But if the sample size is 100, then all of these points have to be plus or minus 10%, which is quite a lot when 20% is the threshold for being dangerous or safe, and yet the plus or minus, just because of the chance, just because of the tossing the biased coin, is plus or minus 10%. So that means that we need to think a bit carefully about choosing our statistical model. And what we do is we say, let's get a bit of science into it. Let's not just draw curves on the whiteboard. And one piece of science is that these flies have to breed in order to be viable, in order to bite people, in order to give them the disease. And they can only breed if it's wet. And in the equator, near the equator, a good surrogate for, a good proxy, a good measure of how wet it is generally, is how green the vegetation is. And the great thing about that is you can measure it from outer space. So that's where the New York lab came in, because the New York lab does a lot of satellite imagery, and it was able to give us this satellite-derived image of the greenness of the vegetation in the country that we're interested in. Now, what else does this fly need to breed successfully? It can't survive night frosts. It can't survive cold. Well, it probably can't survive something less severe than night frost. It doesn't like cold It needs it to be warm and wet. And if you're near the equator, the best predictor of how cold the nights are going to be is how high above the ground level you are. Okay? At the top of a mountain, it's cold. That's why Kilimanjaro still has a little bit of snow on it. All right? So what we also do, and I'm sorry for the quality of this next map, is we get a digital map of elevation. And as in the conventional way, the brown are the mountains and the green are the lowlands, and the pale creamy things are the intermediates. So we say, okay, that crude knowledge from the entomologists who study insects tells us that we ought to be able to relate our prevalence not just to how far east and west we are, but to how wet it is and how warm it is, and we've got data on that, so we can build a model. Okay, and so what we do is we say we've got this, what I'll call ground truth data, which are prevalence surveys, in which we've got these red dots on a map. We've got environmental data in the form of satellite images, which tell us how green it is and how cold it is at night. And our objective is to predict the true prevalence if we measured everybody, not just a sample, but everywhere in the country, and ultimately everywhere in 19 countries. And what we want to do, and this is where don't worry about the actual symbolism there. As a statistician, I said earlier that statisticians will never give you a straight answer. WHO want me to say where that prevalence exceeds 20%, and all I'll tell them is how likely it is that it exceeds 20%, because that's all I can honestly do. But if I tell them there's a very high probability of it exceeding 20%, they'll probably do something. And if I tell them there's a low probability, they probably won't. Those of you who noticed that the scientists were imprisoned for failing to predict an earthquake in Italy recently might feel they were rather badly treated, because logically, if I say there's a 1% chance of a hurricane in Kirkby, Lonsdale tonight, and it happens, I wasn't wrong, right? So that's the tidied up version of my, and that's the model that I fitted, but of course there's more than the blue dots there. There's the greenness and there's the elevation. And the reason I'm not done yet is because of this plus or minus 10% rule. I know if that black line is a good model, how far away the blue dots should be from the black line, because I've tossed a lot of biased coins, and I know how reliable or unreliable the proportion of heads in a biased coin is. So what I do is I add what is called geostatistics, which is basically fitting a wiggly curve that looks a bit, hard to defend. And the point I want to make is not precisely what the black line and the red curve are, but you've got to think of the black line and the red curve as metaphors for the black line is science, the red line is statistics, the blue dots are data, evidence, and so the statistics is bridging between the theoretical science and the empirical evidence in the data. And it's doing it in a way which says, I know how big the sampling error is, the plus or minus on my toss of a biased coin, and so I know that that black curve doesn't tell the whole story, right? And you can see what the red curve's doing. It's kind of compromising between following the data exactly, like my curve here, which would be wrong, and believing the science exactly, which would also be wrong, because unlike physics, this is very approximate science. We don't really know exactly how to measure the risk of being bitten by small flies. Okay, and so basically we use the relationship between the environment and what we see in the surveys to make our black line predictions. We then use geostatistics, or spatial variation as it's called, to actually decide how much we want to deviate from that black line. That's the statistical model. And the modeling always acknowledges that it doesn't know the answer, right? And this is my good friend Peter McCullough, professor of statistics at Chicago University, who says the answer to any prediction problem, you should say the honest answer to any prediction problem, is a probability distribution. It's not a simple yes, no. But you can show empirically that as you go away from the coast, it looks like conditions get a bit better for the breeding fly, and this is height above sea level. And so although I've said height above sea level is a good proxy for nighttime temperature, of course at the coast you get sea breezes and sands, and flies don't like that. So as you go away from the coast and up away from zero height above sea level, prevalence increases, but then it drops catastrophically when you get over about 1,000 meters. If you see the vegetation getting greener, that's associated with higher prevalence. Prevalence goes up as the greenness goes up. It levels out at a value there, which is to do with the technology of the imaging hardware and software. But basically, there's a relationship there, a very loose relationship. And on the left-hand side there, if you actually use that environmental model, that's the wetness and height above sea level model, to predict lower, you get things which are spread around the line of equality, which is not pretty hard to see there, but these rectangular boxes, if the line of equality follows the diagonals of those rectangular boxes. So it's very spread out, but it's kind of pretty good on average. Whereas when you add the geostatistics, what happens is it comes in much tighter. You can see that the scatter is much less in the right than in the left. And that's because we're saying the science has got us halfway there, but there's evidence in the data that what's left is not just random, unstructured variation. There's a pattern to it. It's a geopattern, a geographical pattern, and we can predict it. Now that doesn't look very nice, but what does look a lot nicer is that. So that's the result of the statistical model given back to the people who have to do the field work. And the nasty thing about this map is that everyone calls it the pink map. And the reason that's nasty is because pink says you might as well toss a coin. I have no idea. That's the 50-50 call. And typically, where you've got no data, you can expect the map to be pink, but not always, because up at the north there, you see we've got all that yellow area, and that's because the height above sea level and the greenness of the vegetation have made us very confident in predicting that the prevalence is less than 20%. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm confident that it's low. So I can eliminate a lot of the areas of the map as being safe. Okay, I'm not so good at confirming which are the dangerous areas, but I'm at least restricting the scope. Okay, now that in itself was a useful contributing factor, because they were able then to sort of tell the teams in the yellow areas, do it, go ahead, but they still weren't sure what to do about all the pink areas. And this is where the statistics then fed back into some really imaginative science. And I won't show you the eyeworm photo again, because it's probably some of you haven't had your dinner yet, but what I would like to emphasize is that when I show you dots on a map, every dot on that map represents a lot of hard work in very difficult conditions. And this man on a motorbike is a field epidemiologist. And when he left home several weeks earlier, he was driving a Land Rover. And when the roads ran out, he stopped the Land Rover and he unhitched the motorbike from the back of the Land Rover and he carried on. And all he had with him was a route map with the instructions that when he encounters a village, as he's clearly now done, he should negotiate with the village elder, explain that he's here, not sadly to give them medicine, but to find 100 people willing to have their fingers pricked and blood samples taken, okay, so that we can understand whether we can safely come back and give you the medicine. Okay? Now, I've shown you a data set in which data were collected like that over 200 villages. But that's still a tiny fraction of what we really need. And you can't, just isn't the time or the money, and it isn't safe to go around pricking huge numbers of people's fingers and looking at their blood under microscopes. We just can't begin to do it. And so what some very imaginative people back in Geneva did was produced this photo. And what this again, this is a field epidemiologist, and he's saying to this woman, have you ever suffered from eyeworm? If she says no, he says, thank you very much, and moves on. If she says yes, he said, does it look like this photograph? If she says no, he says, thank you very much, and moves on. If she says yes, he says, does it go away within a week? Remember I told you it wasn't actually terribly serious, just unpleasant, right? 3 yeses, that's a plus. Everything else is a minus. That's a lot easier than taking blood, okay? And you can scale up doing that, but is it any good? And again, you don't have to do any fancy maths to sort of understand the picture here that says it's not perfect, but it's not bad. The two versions here, you don't really need to look at them both. The difference between them is a purely technical difference. But what both pictures are showing you is that where you get a lot of parasitological prevalence, that's parasitology logit, or parasitology prevalence, you also get a high prevalence by this simple 3-question method, which is called RAPLOA, Rapid Lower Assessment. And so what we can do is we can say, that's now a reasonably well-calibrated relationship. We can get lots of data by asking people 3 questions and getting on our bike and going on to the next village, right? And it's not perfect, so we'll need a statistician to tell us, don't read too much into this calibration, but there's clearly information there, right? So we combine all the blood sample data with all the RAPLOA data to come up with a better map. And when I show you the map, you won't think it's better because it looks a lot less fancy. But if you actually look at its geographical scope, it's actually doing a much better job, because although you can't see it here because they're all done in splodges, there are now about 4,000 villages that have been surveyed by the 3-question method. And on the right, the colour coding is red for dangerous, blue for safe, and creamy white for don't know. So you can see that what we've done with this increase from about 200 blood sample surveys to 4,000 questionnaire surveys is we've really narrowed down the range of uncertainty. There are still, on a within-country basis, quite large corridors of uncertainty, but across the whole region, there's an awful lot less. And so that now is the map that they use operationally, so that when they're planning the campaigns of distributing the real drugs, if they're going to the blue areas, they'll just give the drugs. If they're going to the red areas, they'll need to have a team of paramedics signed up to help them. And that's the way the program is actually rolling out its results. Before I finish off, I do just want to read a couple of what I think are really very moving quotes from this book. Okay. Onchocerciasis, that's river blindness, is an end-of-the-road disease. The communities most affected are often the most remote and the most difficult to access. Although some countries have good road networks, meaning that community visits can be completed with a 4x4 vehicle, so that's what a good road is, right? Passable with a Land Rover. Others with fewer inadequate roads require less substantial transport means, such as motorbikes, and I showed you one of the field epidemiologists in there. And sometimes the initial selection of villages needs alternatives, because when you get there, the village doesn't exist anymore, which is common in conflict countries. Several of these epidemiologists have been shot at trying to do their job in places like DRC. These are heroes. One day we were in a national park area where we knew there were lions, and that day we met a lion face to face. He stopped and stared at me. We were shaking like leaves. It was as terrifying as one could imagine. But the lion soon walked away, and we continued. What a hero. And that's why the book's called Charting the Lion's Stare. The communities were so kind and hospitable everywhere we went. They would always offer food or shelter, even though they have nothing. These kindnesses are really touching. So it's not a night at the Holiday Inn for these guys when they finish their day's work. They are fantastic. They really are. And they've gone all over the country doing this kind of work. I just want to show you two of my heroes. The first one, sadly, deceased. The second one, happily still with us. And I know both of them well. And for those of you who have studied science, and particularly if you think statistics is just a branch of mathematics, these two people summarize to me what is a very healthy philosophy of how statistics as a discipline is fundamentally about scientific method. And to me, the real value of statistics is how it interfaces with the rest of science. We need occasionally to stand back from science and do the maths that advances the theory, but if we don't then feed it back into the science, we're kind of missing the point. And Tukey has this rather wonderful quote about, it's better to give an approximate answer to the right question than an exact answer to the wrong question, right? So a parody of academic research is, I'd like to solve an interesting question, but it's too hard, so I'll solve this question instead. Whereas what Tukey said was, well, don't solve the interesting question, but at least contribute it to it, okay? And then David Cox, Sir David Cox, but David to almost everybody he meets, one of the most unassuming knights of the realm you could hope to meet. This is his advice on what somebody should do if they want to set up a statistics department in a university that doesn't have one. They want to set up from scratch a statistics department. And his advice is, go and talk to people in other departments. So his advice is not to sit in your own department, but go over and actually work with people in other disciplines, because it's only by actually embedding yourself in other people's science that you'll really get it and make the point. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of the kind of way I work. I do think that statisticians are there to add value to science. They're very humble souls. They don't make breakthroughs in their own right. They just add a bit of value to other people's breakthroughs. In blue, I love this quote as well, that we buy information with assumptions means that we don't just analyse data, we also add scientific assumptions. And if those scientific assumptions are well-founded, we get a much sharper answer than if we just analyse data. So statisticians don't just analyse data. Or at least in my opinion, they shouldn't. They should analyse problems. And to analyse those problems well, they need to talk to people in other disciplines. And I think there's a lesson there for secondary schools, which is that I actually disagree with the Royal Statistical Society's verdict on teaching statistics in schools. There was a review conducted some years ago by another friend and happily alive eminent statistician called Sir Adrian Smith. And he recommended that statistics at secondary schools should be taken out of the maths curriculum and put in the science curriculum. And the Royal Statistical Society said, we do not agree with this, despite the fact that Adrian was a recent president of the Royal Statistical Society when he made the report. I think he was spot on. I think statisticians who are going to be professional statisticians need lots of rigorous hard maths. And the best way to train a good statistician is to give them a maths degree first, right? And then teach them statistics as a graduate degree, in my humble opinion. But if you want to actually get teenagers to understand data and how data translates into evidence and decisions, I think you should be embedding your statistics within your science curriculum. And I mean that broadly. I include social science, natural science, medical science. And I do think that that's the way we should be going. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and leave you. Well, not quite leave you. I'm happy to stay around and chat to anyone who wishes. Yeah.